Good afternoon, everyone. Maureen with God's Good Table again, and I'm really happy to be with you this afternoon. We've had a fantastic weekend at Melvin's Farm to Fork store in Little Fort, Virginia, where we just held our God-given Food as Medicine conference. And man, was it ever, ever good. I don't think there was a single person there who didn't walk away feeling truly blessed. From the little children in the children's program that our daughter Abby and our friend Carrie headed up, to the woman with cancer and the people with the autoimmune disease, and each of our really, really knowledgeable and articulate speakers. And Ken, our worship leader. We just had such a wonderful, blessed time. This is an event that we're not going to do again this year, but we would love to do it again because the information provided is truly helpful and a blessing to help others learn how they can heal from serious and even little ailments, and prevent disease as well as overcome. So I'm just very grateful. Each of our conferences has been wonderful. This one was extra special and different. It, I just can't describe it well enough. We will have recordings available soon for the nominal fee of, I think, $37. Once the videos are edited and ready to go up, we'll let everyone know, and then you can purchase through our link or through a link that will provide our exhibitors and our speakers. So be looking for that. I think you too will be blessed by what you learn, even if you weren't able to be there. So with that said, I'm going to give a quick shout out also to one of our favorite companies who also were exhibitors, at our conference, and that is Dirt and Devotion, a family-owned company, a family that we've grown to just truly love and feel so grateful for that God has brought them into our paths. Dirt and Devotion puts out beautiful clothing, from the kerchief that I'm wearing to the sweatshirt, and I guess I'd have to kind of stand up. Life began in a garden. It truly did, and I thought it was so very fitting for our topic as well as for our event, which actually was rather chilly at times, especially Sunday morning. And so Dirt and Devotion sold every one of their sweatshirts. But we like to patronize them, and their eldest daughter, who is adopted, is going through a difficult time with a type of leukemia that's rather difficult to treat. And so we were able to put together a raffle basket to bless them with, which was wonderful. But we can all continue to bless them just by visiting their website and purchasing some of their beautiful clothing. Brent, the dad, is the graphic designer, and then the family works together to print and market their clothing, much of which, if not all of which, is organic cotton, no synthetic yucky materials, just really nice. So dirtanddevotion.com. I'll send you there. Erin will put a link in the show notes as well. Today's topic is one that I feel is very important, especially after interviewing Pork Rind the other week. We talked about the carnivore diet, and we got questions right away. Things like, what? Do you mean I can't eat vegetables? And so we felt very strongly that we needed to address the conundrum. How do we figure out and decipher what we should be eating? And with all of these question marks floating around in our heads about, well, what's good? Because this person says this and the other person says that. And what really is healthy for us? So I thought it important that we go ahead and address these questions and hopefully clear up any confusion. And I'm going to come to the carnivore diet second, but I'm going to start with talking about veganism and the hallelujah diet. Now, my sweatshirt is appropriate for that hallelujah diet, which in fact was a vegan diet. Coming from a biblical perspective, it sounded really good. It sounded really good to me many years ago when I first really started digging deep, wanting to learn what kinds of food I should be eating myself and what I should be feeding my family. And I thought, well, it's the original diet. It was good for Adam and Eve, so certainly it's good for me as well. It just made sense until it didn't. Because then I thought later about, the land of Canaan being described as the land flowing with milk and honey. Milk and honey are by no means vegan. And so I'm going to use this term interchangeably because the hallelujah diet is simply a vegan diet dressed up with biblical background. So from that biblical standpoint, one thing that I really want us to think about is that there was the fall, there was sin. Adam and Eve were evicted from the garden, and they did not continue to live and eat the same way that they had in that absolutely perfect environment. Remember also that Adam and Eve were designed and constructed by God to be absolute perfection. I oftentimes wonder, what did they look like? I hope we can find that out one day because it's an intriguing question. But God built Adam from the literal ground up and Eve from his rib, and they were absolutely perfect. So keep that in mind and then think about how the environment that they were in also was itself perfection. Even when they fled the garden, when they were evicted, everything was pure, whole, and good. Now there were thorns, and I presume things like ticks and mosquitoes, but the environment was producing beautiful food just as God had designed it to be. But eventually, the earth was corrupted. Now, I also like to think about how Cain and Abel were farmers of two different types. So one grew vegetables and one raised animals, including sheep and goats. In my mind, I go to the thought that surely in these early stages of the world, and with few people, now I am totally convinced that there were brothers and sisters and they intermarried when the gene pool also itself was perfection and they populated the earth. While they had to toil and produce food with hard work and sweat, they probably were consuming something other than just vegetables, because otherwise, what is the need for sheep and goats? My mind goes to milk in particular. I am guessing that even the earliest people consumed dairy products once they left the garden, possibly even before. I don't know. I don't see them eating meat, but I do wonder about sheep and goats. And, the fig leaves were not enough to cover Adam and Eve. God gave them animal skin. He fashioned clothing out of animal skin to cover their nakedness. And this opens up the question of, did they eat the animal? We don't really know with all certainty when people began to eat meat. We do know, however, that when Noah and his family left the ark, God told him to sacrifice animals and eat meat. There were 7 of the clean animals on board the ark as opposed to 2 of every other kind. And that was so that the first people had something to eat after the flood. So certainly eating meat is good. And then we see the sacrificial system and the product of these animal sacrifices being distributed to the priests and their families, because their entire job was, in fact, to serve the people and to serve God, while others were able to go out and actually farm and raise animals and presumably grow some vegetables or harvest things. I don't know. But the priesthood was given a portion of every sacrifice for their family to sustain them. And an interesting facet of this is that it included not just the flesh meat, but the organs and the fat. And what was the most prized of all fats in God's eyes? What did he personally want for himself? He wanted the saturated fats that surrounded the organs. He called that the very best. And so we should never assume that saturated fats and animal fats are harmful to us. In fact, they are some of the best foods for us because of the nutrients that the fats contain. Now, in a vegan diet and the Hallelujah diet, and even in some of the Blue Zone diets, which we'll come to later, people did and do acquire most of their fats and their fat-soluble nutrients from vegetables. However, these nutrients are not the same as the animal fats. The animal fats contain fully formed true vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin K, the Wolsen factor, some things that probably have not even yet been discovered. But these are nutrients that are not found in plant-based foods, and our bodies have a difficult time taking the precursors, for instance, of vitamin A, which is so critical for our health, for the formation of healthy babies within the womb, to healthy skin and eyesight. We do have the precursors in plant-based foods, but our bodies have a difficult time converting those nutrients, those precursors, into fully formed vitamin A. Now, if we're young, if we haven't had antibiotics, if we don't have illnesses, our bodies can do that to a larger degree. But the older we get and the more damaged our bodies are from pharmaceuticals, from toxins, from lack of exercise, and everything else that we experience in our modern world, the less ability our bodies have to convert the precursors, the carotenoids, into fully formed vitamin A. And that is why we really need animal fats. We also need the vitamin D that comes fully formed in animal products. In fact, we can make vitamin D in our own bodies. It can be synthesized in the subcutaneous layer of our skin. But again, it requires saturated fat and also particular rays of the sun, the beta rays in particular, which act upon the surface of the skin, penetrate, and then there is a metabolic conversion of saturated fats into cholesterol and into vitamin D. But our bodies are not able to produce enough of that. And think about it, year round, and even throughout the day in our summer months, those beta rays are very short. They don't penetrate the Earth's atmosphere, but at the height of the day and when the Earth is closest to the sun. And so we really do require vitamin D from animal sources. It's very difficult to get enough of it on our own. And so you can begin to see why, just from a fatty acid standpoint, we really do need animal products to some degree. Um, Also, I talk often about the principle similar to homeopathy. Homeopathy says like cures like, and I like to say that like builds like. And why do we eat? God put in us the desire and the need to eat so that we can continually replenish our bodies with the building blocks that are required to build, rebuild, and maintain healthy tissues. A plant doesn't have muscles. Grains have wonderful nutrients, but they don't have, for instance, colloids to build healthy connective tissue. And so this comes from, again, animal foods. And we talk about nose to tail nutrition. I think that is absolutely critical. But understanding just these basic principles, you can see why I can never advocate for a vegan diet or the hallelujah diet, no matter how biblically based it is. But there are other nutrients as well in animal foods, such as zinc. Red meat is very rich in zinc, which builds a strong immune system. We just can't get away from all of the wonderful benefits that come from animal foods. I mentioned nose to tail and like building like. I do believe that we should be consuming the heart, the liver, the kidney, the spleen, even the brain. Yes, all of that. And then that helps to build those same organs. And an example is the heart muscle contains CoQ10, which is part of the beating of a healthy, strong heart. Without it, our heart can weaken. And man, if you've been on statins, I hope not. They're very dangerous. That's another show, not for today. But if you've been on statins for any length of time, your CoQ10 is depleted. So we need the CoQ10 that comes from the heart muscle of an animal. I enjoy chopping up chicken hearts and sauteing them with shallots and in butter or ghee and with a little garlic. There are a variety of ways to consume the organ meats. And this past weekend, we enjoyed bone marrow. We had bone marrow as an appetizer for our VIP dinner. We consumed meatloaf also at our VIP dinner, which was made with an organ meat blend. So it was ground beef with heart and with liver. We made a chili, with the same kind of a mixture. It was absolutely delicious. And if you think that you don't like organ meats or that the idea of it makes you feel like throwing up, and it does, I know it does for many people. It did me at one time. When you mix it into something that is very full flavored and savory, like chili or meatloaf, you don't taste the organs. If you're using mostly organ meat, you're probably going to taste some liver. But if you have a nice blend, an appropriate blend, for instance, I'm not typically just eating a whole heart. I'm eating a portion in a proportionate ratio to the flesh meat. And that just makes sense to me. So that's one way to get those animal foods in. And I think with that, we can move on, with the exception of one last comment about veganism. And that is that when the late Dr. Weston A. Price studied cultures all over the world, he was looking at their traditional diets and he hoped to find a culture that didn't consume animal foods. He was curious about this. There was not a culture anywhere in the world that only consumed animal foods, that only consumed plant-based foods. Now, we'll come back to that idea again later when we talk about the blue zones. But right now, I'm going to move on to the carnivore diet, which we talked about with pork rind a couple of weeks ago. And I'm going to tell you, I said I will do carnivore for the month of April and see what happens. I did not stick to that. I will give it a try for a week, but I'm not going to commit to a month. I did it for a few days. I find it very difficult to maintain. In particular, when I'm making meals most days for an entire family and for frequent guests that arrive at my table. I also stated in that particular episode that I believe very strongly in consuming fermented vegetables with my meats and fats because they contain live active enzymes that break down in your gut the fats and the proteins. So I think that is a very important part of any meal plan, and it doesn't exactly fit in with carnivore. While pork rind was with us this past weekend, in fact, I think it's okay to say this, he ate vegetables. He ate ferments. And he also ate some vegetables in a stew that I made for one of our meals. Um, he told me that he had been feeling good on the carnivore, but he was missing the vegetables. And for the weekend, he went off pure carnivore, and pure carnivore minus the dark, high antioxidant berries that he consumes to satisfy his sweet tooth. Um, so we'll see where he goes from there. I would like to give it a try just to see how I feel after maybe a week. But here's my point with the carnivore diet, and this overlaps with every other diet that we'll talk about. I do not believe that we are designed to completely eliminate for a length of time an entire food group. God gave us wonderful foods to consume and a wide variety of foods. Hey, my cat, she's a carnivore. And when she killed a mouse just 2 nights ago in the middle of the night. Somehow she found one in our room, went into our ensuite, and there on the floor was indeed a little mouse that she was playing with and about to devour. Typically, when she finds a rodent outside or a bird and leaves it at the front porch, she's leaving only the head, which is kind of surprising to me because I would think she would eat the brain, but she's eating the innards first. She's totally consuming the innards of that rodent. If you look at a big cat, say a lion or a tiger or a carnivorous bear, when they kill their prey, they don't say, "Oh, great, I get to have a raw hamburger," or they don't just tear into it and eat the. My point is, they're not eating just the flesh meat. They first consume the innards, including the contents of the stomach. So while we call them carnivores because they're not going out and harvesting for themselves vegetables and berries, they actually are eating the stomach contents of herbivores, which means that they're getting grains, they're getting nuts, they're getting seeds, they're probably getting flowers, they're getting whatever their prey has consumed as an herbivore. And so, really, in the truest sense of the word, they are not herbivores. Excuse me, they are not carnivores because they are also consuming vegetation from the contents of their prey stomach. So that's important to think about. That thought occurred to me recently, and I pondered it, and I thought, it's really wrong to even assume in a carnivorous diet as a human that we shouldn't consume anything else based on what a carnivore eats because they're eating these other things. There are, again, nutrients in grains and in vegetables, in nuts and seeds that are not present in the flesh meat or the organ meat of animals. And our bodies are designed to use those nutrients. There's a whole range of B vitamins, for instance, in grains. And while B12 is inherent only in animal foods, there is an array of other B vitamins that we get from grains. We get the carotenes and iron and many other nutrients from vegetables. But when we ferment those vegetables, it's like an explosion of nutrients. When we cook those vegetables, even lightly, and serve them with a fat like olive oil or butter, ghee, lard or tallow, schmaltz, then the fatty acids in those animal fats actually increase to a very large degree the bioavailability of the plant foods. Whereas if we eat those foods raw, we have, in many cases, oxalates, such as in dark leafy greens, goitrogens in cruciferous vegetables, and those things can cause our bodies harm. So they should, for the most part, be at least lightly cooked and or fermented, and then you get a far wider range and higher bioavailability of nutrients from our plant-based foods. So again, I recommend against eliminating entirely any food group for any lengthy period of time, perhaps just for a short time. But there is a time for that, and we're going to come to that in a moment. Now, I want to talk about the keto diet, the Atkins diet. Atkins is the ketogenic diet. A ketogenic diet is one in which you consume very little carbs to force your body to burn fat instead of carbs for energy. Well, our bodies, especially our hearts and our organs, they like to consume saturated fat. They do better. That's the best fuel for our heart, for instance. That's why if you've ever butchered an animal, you will see that the heaviest concentration of fat is around the heart muscle and the other organs. That's because that is fuel for those organs. So if you eliminate saturated fat, you're eliminating the very best fuel for your organs and also your brain. And every cell in our body requires these fats and cholesterol in order to provide structure as well as nutrients and metabolic functions, along with salt. We need the salt as well, and we've talked about that before. You can refer back to my interview with Daryl from Redmond Real Salt to learn more about the body's requirement for salt. But our bodies actually generally do prefer fat as a fuel, but we also need carbohydrates. We can get those carbs from vegetables. Our brain actually burns a lot of carbohydrates. So to go on a ketogenic diet, our brains make an adjustment and find carbs from what little uh, vegetable input we might take in, and we should. On a ketogenic diet, again, I'm not talking carnivorous diet, but in a tongue-tied today. On a ketogenic diet, we're not saying to totally eliminate carbs, but to limit carbs. Now, I have thrived 2 different periods of time on a ketogenic diet. When you consume mostly fat and moderate amounts of protein and very low amounts of carbs, and choose carbs wisely from vegetables and small amounts of grain, it sends your body into ketosis, which is a good thing. And the ketones are actually fuel for the brain. Um, and then because your body is burning fat for fuel, you slim down. So I've done this very successfully and combined moderate exercise, not cardio, not intense, just a few days a week of moderate exercise, along with intermittent fasting. I've done so well with losing and maintaining a healthy weight. However, I understand now the importance of carbs for the body. And so what I actually practice now is a modified ketogenic diet. I take one day, say the 8th day, off and consume potatoes, brown whole rice, quinoa, um, my sourdough breads, and I just enjoy it for a day. I still have some meat and fats, but lesser, with a greater concentration on plant-based carbohydrates, not sugar ever. Okay. And this allows my body to still take in the nutrients it needs while maintaining or arriving at a healthier weight. Currently, I am back on a modified ketogenic diet. I will have a slice of my good bread toasted with copious amounts of butter. I'll have a little bit of quinoa, maybe just a spoonful. It sops up the flavors from the rest of my plate, but primarily in the morning, because in the morning I can use the carbohydrates in those foods as fuel. So it doesn't sit and collect around my waist. I currently am at a place where, because I had gone off of not just the ketogenic diet, actually, I pretty much live on that full time for the most part. But I had gone off of my intermittent fasting and my regular exercise. And so I'm currently losing, I have about 20 more pounds to lose. I've lost almost 10. I had gained, I wasn't obese. I was not looking good, however. And so I chose to go back on a stricter ketogenic diet. And I am exercising in my pool primarily, or taking walks or hikes about 5 times a week, 4 or 5 times a week. And I'm not eating in the evening. I try to not eat within about 4 hours of bedtime, because if you're eating in the evening and then you're going to bed within a few hours, your body's not burning off the fuel that you've just ingested. And so it's going to collect on your body instead in the form of fat. So those two things for me, the intermittent fasting and the moderate exercise, are just as important as the ketogenic diet anyway. And I recommend to anyone who does a ketogenic diet that they modify it with some carbs and also include the intermittent fasting and the moderate exercise. So when I say intermittent fasting, I should also qualify. I typically fast for about 15 hours overnight, and then I'll eat, as I said, maybe a slice of sourdough toast with a lot of butter, and I'll eat an egg. I can't really eat two anymore. I just am not that hungry. And then at lunchtime, I might make myself a burger and some stock. Oh, I love my chicken stock. Um, Sometimes I take coconut oil and ghee and I mix it together, and I'll take a spoonful of that mid-morning also, and it gives me energy and it keeps my body in ketosis. So that intermittent fasting is important overnight and then in between meals. And then I do not snack in between. And you know what? Because I'm eating a fair amount of protein and fat, I'm not hungry. I don't need to snack. A lot of people think that a ketogenic diet is difficult because they can't eat all of the carbs that they're used to, and they don't even want to give it a try. But let me tell you, when you're eating protein and fat, you're not hungry for carbs. So it's easy. It's very easy for me to forego the other things and just keep it in a limited amount. Now, I did go off over the weekend and I enjoyed a wonderful ice cream on Sunday afternoon. It was delightful. The last time I had done that was September, when we went on family vacation and found a wonderful homemade ice cream parlor in North Myrtle Beach. So if you're going to go off and take a break once in a while, make it worthwhile. That ice cream was worth it. It was very good. I do make my own ice cream, by the way, but I don't put very much sugar in it at all. I'll put a little bit of maple syrup or honey, and I'll use my concentrated monk fruit sweetener to give it just a hint of sweetness. But once you've given up the sweets, your taste buds adjust, and you don't want and don't enjoy the same amount of sweetness as you did prior. All right. With that, then I'm going to go to the paleo and the paleo autoimmune protocol, which is very similar to the GAPS diet, which we'll also talk about. So the paleo diet is one that operates on the premise that Paleolithic people, which I actually don't believe in, consumed no grains and no dairy. I believe that the premise of this is false to begin with. Again, as I've already talked about from the Garden of Eden onward, but also archaeologically speaking, we find residue from as far back as archaeologists have found shards of pottery that have the residue from milk. Um, People have been harvesting wild grain and then cultivating grain, not from the very beginning of time, possibly, I'm not convinced, but certainly for thousands of years. And so I patently reject the idea that well, first of all, of the Paleolithic man anyway, but I also reject the idea that people haven't always consumed some grains and some dairy. In fact, nearly every culture in the world, nearly every ancient culture has consumed dairy products, whether they milk musk oxen, water buffalo, cows, sheep, goats, camels, um, not dogs and cats. But all of those animals have been milked for thousands of years, and people have taken great benefit from the dairy that their mammals produce, as well as the meats. Um, the dairy contains nutrients, again, that are particular to animal foods that are difficult to get, if not impossible. Well, pretty much impossible, I'll say, just from vegetables. But in addition to that, they contain beneficial microorganisms. And every culture made from their dairy kefir, skyr, yogurt, cheeses, a wide variety of fermented or cultured products, which create more digestible proteins because the proteins are broken down, lower sugar content because the carbs in the milk are broken down as fuel for the microbes in the culturing process. And then this entire culturing and microbial activity produces more nutrients, just as when we talk about fermenting vegetables and how that creates more nutrients. The same is true with culturing dairy. And so the only possible exceptions of dairy production in ancient cultures would include possibly the Eskimos in the extreme north of Alaska, or I've found it difficult to find many cultures at all who didn't traditionally consume some dairy, because even in the coldest regions, in Scandinavia, for instance, people still milk, and have for thousands of years milked reindeer and musk oxen. So even in very cold climates, people consumed dairy products. So I am going to totally reject the notion of a paleo diet. However, if you are needing to heal your gut, to overcome especially autoimmune problems, then I'll usher in the paleo autoimmune protocol, which is very similar to the GAPS diet. So I'm going to talk about those together. The paleo diet rejects dairy and grains. The paleo autoimmune protocol is primarily animal-based, not entirely, but primarily. It should include some fermented vegetables, but you're avoiding all sugars except for maybe a small amount of honey. And the idea is that you're going to heal the gut, and then you'll be able to overcome your illness and disease, and eventually eat these and incorporate these other foods into your diet again. Now, with the GAPS diet, Gut and Psychology Syndrome, which was a book written about 20 years ago by my friend, Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride, she developed this protocol in order to try to help her son overcome autism, which she did successfully with this diet. She tweaked the Gottchild diet, the specific carbohydrate diet, and added more bone broth. The GAPS diet is especially based, the primary food is going to be bone broth right from the get-go. But she also eventually does include a 24-hour cultured yogurt, which the paleo autoimmune protocol would not do because, again, they reject dairy products. But the GAPS diet wants you to be able to eventually take benefit from those foods, and also to take benefit from the microbes to help heal and seal the gut. And therefore, she does include a slow start on a 24-hour cultured raw dairy. I actually use Trimona yogurt, which is low temperature vat pasteurized dairy from totally grass-fed animals in a very clean environment in Pennsylvania. And again, it's cultured for 24 hours. So the lactose, the milk sugar, is almost totally consumed. And this is important because the milk sugars will feed the what we call pathogenic organisms, which are actually not in and of themselves bad. It's when they're out of proportion to the beneficial microorganisms. But the cultured dairy contains many beneficial organisms that help to keep the gut microbiome in check. And so we want to include that, whereas the autoimmune protocol does not. Now I'm going to take a little sidestep into another biblical plan, which is called the Daniel plan. Again, the Daniel plan is based on biblical teaching and biblical example, and it has really good points about it. It stresses eating seasonally, eating locally. Those two things are really important. I believe that we are designed to thrive in the environment in which we live, and that God provides the nutrients in the plants and the animal kingdoms that our bodies need in whatever environment we live. And so that eating seasonally and locally is really important. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to use lemon juice when you live in the north like I do. I actually have lime trees growing in my atrium, but they wouldn't naturally grow here. They don't grow outside. It's not to say that you can't ever or shouldn't ever consume another food from outside of your own microclimate, but it stresses eating within your region, eating seasonally, eating locally, eating a combination of vegetables and animals. It doesn't understand the need for fermented foods, and it does stress low-fat animal products. In fact, they start you out on a 40-day fast, and then they work you back into eating a wider variety of foods. But during that time of fasting, you're fasting primarily from those very things that they think that Daniel did consume when he was in captivity in Babylon. And here is where I think they get it wrong. Well, let me go back to the 40 days first. You're praying, you're fasting from certain foods, and you're getting exercise, which in my mind should include work, not just exercise. We just have it way too easy these days with work. But at the end of that 40 days, your faith should be stronger, and your body should be cleansed of toxins from eating foods that we weren't meant to eat. And then you're incorporating the whole foods diet again. But it does stress low fat. Now, this diet was designed not by God. I'll disagree with their premise, but by Rick Warren, the author of Purpose Driven Life, Dr. Mark Hyman. It's 4 people. I can't even remember the other 2 right off the top of my head. Anyway, again, it goes back to the idea that Daniel thrived on a diet of vegetables in Babylon. And so we today should be able to thrive by following his example, by not consuming much meat and much animal products, but more vegetables and grains. Here's my beef. Daniel grew up on a not very, 100% traditional Jewish diet, his friends as well. And that diet included meat. It included fish, it included lamb, it included beef, and a fair amount of it. And so the fact that Daniel, as a young man, was able to thrive on a plant-based diet for a short period of time, living in captivity, is partially due to the fact we have to credit that he didn't grow up eating that way. Humans, in order to build new humans and maintain health, need the nutrients from animal foods, as we've already talked about. Daniel was able to thrive partly because that's how his body was built. That's what his body was built on. But secondly, don't we just dismiss God's hand in all of this? We're supposed to look at the example of Daniel and see God. See God. God had his hand in Daniel's life. And that is, I believe, the primary reason why Daniel and his friends thrived while rejecting the king's unclean foods. And that is, in fact, why they needed to abstain from the king's table, because the foods were not clean. They were not the foods that God said to eat. They were not produced the way God gave us instruction to produce food. And that's all in there. We're going to delve into that pretty soon here. God gives us instruction in all of these things, but the king's table was not filled with foods, animal foods or otherwise, but especially with animal foods that were produced appropriately and according to God's design. So let's give credit to God and credit to the Jewish diet that God gave his people, and see that that's why Daniel and his 3 friends thrived in Babylon, in captivity, refraining from the king's table. All right. I feel like I'm getting preachy, but I'm passionate about this stuff. Now, I'll talk for a minute about the blue zones. The blue zones are called the blue zones. Well, I'll describe that in just a moment. But essentially, they are areas of the world like Okinawa and Sardinia in Italy, where populations consume a lot of vegetable products and live a very long life, like 100 years. These are areas of the world that have the highest concentration of octogenarians. And Dan Buettner and his researcher friends, as they were looking into these zones, they were circling with a blue pen the locations on a map, and that's how they came to be called the blue zones. Dan Buettner was a bit of an adventurer, a researcher, and he just had questions and had the ability to travel the world and learn about these populations and what they were doing. Now, in the populations that he looked at, there was a wide variety of diet. There were actually some people who consumed almost entirely vegetarian diet or even vegan. And I am going to say that these people also had the ancestry of meat eaters. The diets post World War II or during World War II changed in some of these regions because land was destroyed and the best foods were going to the troops. And so when we talk about the Mediterranean diet, for instance, and I'll include this in blue zones, the ancestral diet was not as high in vegetable products. It would have contained more fish, shellfish, goat, sheep, and mutton, and other animal products than what became the primary diet later, World War II and later. So you've already got basically good bones. I'm going to say you've got the good bones. The foundation is laid. And these people still consume some animal foods, but one culture, very, very little. And then other cultures consumed just a lot of vegetables, but also fish, shellfish, a little mutton and such. Just not a massive volume. I love a good steak or a good cheeseburger. Man, do I love it. But that's not where these people were getting most of their nutrients. But it's really, really key to understand why they were so healthy. Partly they're eating very clean foods. Their diets are limited. They are not eating foods from all over the world like we do in the Western world today, but they were eating foods that were very nutrient dense. But in addition to that, we have to consider that they're walking miles and miles. They're walking every day. They're not taking cars and commuting to work. They're working on farms. They're working in their villages. They're walking from here to there. They're getting a lot of sunshine and fresh air. and they're barefoot in the dirt. They're grounding. They don't even know what grounding is, but they're grounding. They're taking in the earth's energy through bare feet or leather sandaled feet, which we're going to do a talk about this. I'm going to get Dr. Stephen Hussey back on, and we're going to go deeper into this with him. But I cannot overstate the importance of coming into contact with your bare skin, with the sun's rays and the energy from the earth. It is tremendously impactful on the human body. It cannot be overstated. And this is how these people were living. And they were resting. They weren't overworking. They were resting. They took siestas in the afternoon. Can you see where I'm going with this? True human health is actually about more than just food. It really is. It incorporates so much more. And in our modern world today, we don't do that. So when Dan Buettner was looking at these populations 20 years ago, they're living very differently than our modern world, and they're living so much longer and healthier lives. So let's remember those lessons from the blue zones, not just the fact that they didn't tend to incorporate the volume or the ratio of animal foods that we do typically today. I personally believe they would be just as healthy living the same lifestyle and eating more animal foods, but they're perfectly fine. So why mess with a good thing? Now, I want to talk just briefly about what did Jesus eat? And see, to me, that is the quintessential example. What did Jesus eat? We know he ate naturally fermented bread, and bread is used as a metaphor throughout the Bible. And this is why I cannot say get rid of the grains. I do believe that the human body is designed by God to consume a wide variety of foods, including grain, but whole grain, clean grain, not the conventional grain that is always sprayed with glyphosate and other chemicals, but clean grain, whole grain, freshly ground grain, and not grain that you grind and you add yeast and 2 hours later you have bread. No, because all seeds, nuts, and grains contain anti-nutrients, phytic acid, and enzyme inhibitors that protect that seed from sprouting out of season, which would be disastrous if you want to have more grain for the next year or generations to come. But those anti-nutrients, as we commonly call them, are broken down through sprouting, soaking, and fermentation. So that in the Scottish Hebrides, for instance, the people there now 100 years ago consumed a lot of oatmeal. That was the backbone of their diets. They had oats in the morning, they had oat cakes, they had oats all the time, but their oats were always soaking. They would keep a pot over the fire, as Dr. Price wrote, or in the fireplace, and they were just continually adding oat groats or rolled oats to that. It was continually soaking, and it was acidifying and breaking down the anti-nutrients. Sourdough bread is fermented over many hours with presumably a sourdough starter. I also teach a European starter called a Polish, which is very similar to sourdough, but you don't have to raise another child. More on that. We have a course on our website. We have 2 courses. One, the School of Traditional Skills, which is an intensive sourdough. And we also have my bread making class, which teaches both of these methods. But the point is that the loaf is fermented over many hours. I typically let mine sit all night or all day. The anti-nutrients are broken down. The gluten is more digestible. The carbohydrates are fewer, and you get a very flavorful loaf of bread, far more flavorful than that loaf of bread you could make in an hour or 2. Jesus ate this type of bread. And remember at the Passover, they ate unleavened bread, which meant unfermented bread. So it didn't The Israelites didn't have time for the bread to rise when they left Egypt. And that's the point of unleavened bread. And also that Jesus' body did not undergo decay like fermentation. That brings me to wine, which we'll come back to later. So he ate sourdough bread. He definitely ate fish, didn't he? There are frequent passages wherein he's breaking bread and fish, like the miracle of feeding the 5,000, or after his resurrection, when he was cooking fish on the shore of Lake Galilee, and his followers found him, and he shared. So fish was a common food for Jesus. But again, as I talked about earlier, the Israelites consumed lamb, especially Passover in particular, and they consumed beef. They didn't consume unclean animals that might be contaminated like pork, but they consumed beef and they consumed lamb. They presumably also consumed mutton. So they were getting meat in their diet as well, and they would have also been making soup, making broth, right? Jesus would have eaten cheese. And so we've got cheese, we've got meat, we've got bitter herbs, the bitter herbs which stimulate the gallbladder chimes into the stomach. And so that was a part of typical meals every day. Americans used to do that too 100 years ago, but we don't do it anymore. He would not have consumed any canned vegetables because canning was not a thing, but he would have consumed some fermented vegetables. He would have certainly been consuming salt and olive oil and butter, all of these good things, and the healthy fats from the animals like the schmaltz, the chicken fat, tallow. Foods were cooked in tallow and olive oil and butter. And this pretty much sums up what a typical Jew, including Jesus, would have eaten. And I think it's wonderful to go back to Jesus' diet. But we don't have to do it. We don't have to do it fully, completely, 100% of the time. And just a quick note on clean and unclean. I do not believe that is a salvation issue. And I also do not personally believe that all of the unclean foods, including shellfish and pork, are off limits anymore. With Peter and the sheet and God lowering the sheet 3 times saying, take and kill and eat. And that sheet had things like catfish and pork. I don't believe that was just a spiritual metaphor. I personally believe that is a dictate to it's okay to eat these foods now, but they need to be raised properly. And in Jesus' time and prior, our lakes and rivers and streams and oceans were not polluted like they are now, but the catfish were the cleanup crew, and they still are. But pork was the cleanup crew for the human beings. And so it would not have been okay to eat. Also, Beverly Rubik did some testing on this, and you can look at the westinaprice.org website and look at live blood cell analysis by Beverly Rubik. In this study, she looked at how people's blood changed, the construction of the red blood cells, and how the cells, red and white, how the cells move throughout the bloodstream prior to eating a meal, including pork, and after. And what she found is that when someone ate, say, a pork chop, I don't remember what specific pork related food it was that they were consuming, but she tested their blood a period of time after, allowing for the digestion and for the pork to have an effect on the body. And what she found was that there was a tremendous clumping and sluggishness of the red blood cells. Well, I can see why that would not be healthy and good for us then to consume pork. However, she then tested it with consuming pork and sauerkraut, pork and a fermented vegetable, which, by the way, they kind of just naturally go together, don't they? And what she found was when the pork was consumed with a fermented food, that the fermentation, the enzymes presumably within that fermented product completely mitigated that clumping and sluggishness that happened from just eating straight pork. And so I tell you that to say that the clean versus unclean, you have to make that decision. Erin and I have been shut down in the past when people have come to our table when we've exhibited or we've been out speaking, and they've said, "Well, how do you feel about clean and unclean meat?" And we say it's a personal decision. And some people who are absolutely adamant you never touch anything unclean will just walk away and they won't even hear us out. And I think that that's wrong. People, we need to have a conversation. And we need to give one another grace. We need to be able to consider other people's thoughts, convictions, experience, and really think about um, let's not be so judgmental. And that's something we need to not be anyway across the board. But let's not judge one another on what we eat and whether or not we eat clean or unclean foods. Now, my last point is simply this: how do we recover when we have followed one of these very strict diets and our body is missing nutrients and perhaps sluggish and even damaged? My rule of thumb is you take it slowly. If you've been eating a carnivore diet, by all means, add in the ferments and slowly add in the vegetables. If you haven't been consuming grains for a long time, maybe you're celiac or you're gluten intolerant, heal the gut first and then slowly start taking in a small amount of grain, a small piece of sourdough, always with lots of butter or fat, because that soothes the stomach and the response. But with bread in particular, it has to be sourdough, or it has to be fully fermented, whether it's a foolish or a sourdough. It has to go through a long fermentation to make that gluten more digestible and diminished, as well as the carbs, and it needs to be with fat. But you first have to work on gut healing when you have that type of an autoimmune issue. Um, if you've gone from vegan or vegetarian, vegetarians can be healthy if they're consuming um, a quantity of fats and a variety of fish and poultry, but they still need some red meat. You need to start incorporating the red meat because you need the nutrients that's there too. Just take it slowly and always with a little bit of a ferment to help you digest that food. So go low and slow, introducing one thing at a time, and you'll probably be just fine. Some people can start eating just about anything right away. It just depends upon how long you've been on such a restrictive diet and what is the status of your gut health. So, with that, I'm going to leave you with embrace all of the wonderful foods that God has given us. Learn that we need to eat a variety of foods. We should be eating seasonally and locally. I firmly believe in that as well. And don't forget work or exercise, preferably work and exercise, and get lots of sunshine, especially early morning and midday. Also, limit your screen time, especially in the evening with blue light and LED lights. You can wear blue light blockers. They have the yellow hue. Some of my eyeglasses have that slight yellowish hue that blocks some of the blue light coming off of my computer, for instance. But eat a variety of foods and enjoy them and benefit from them. And Carmen says that she just got a new delivery of ghee. That's wonderful. Enjoy it. Ghee doesn't burn like butter, so you can cook with it more easily, saute with it, bake with it. I use it in some of my breads that I make because butter with water and milk solids actually will burn faster whereas ghee doesn't. It has a high smoke point. So enjoy that ghee, Carmen. And it's such a wonderful healing food. It's really wonderful. It's rich in antioxidants, rich in vitamin A and vitamin D, and it's anti-inflammatory. So that's a wonderful food to consume. That's it. Next week, I believe we're interviewing my friend Tom, and we're going to talk about how to sustainably and regeneratively raise your own food, vegetables in particular, but also the vegetables that feed the animals that we eat as well. So we'll talk about regenerative and sustainable agriculture, including a special focus on gardening, which is my primary thing right now. So we're going to come back and talk about that next week. And we have a couple of other really interesting conversations coming up, including with Lily Nichols, who wrote Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, and others. I'm super excited for all of these that we have coming up. And I hope to see you back next week, 3 p.m. We invite your comments and your questions. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please do like, subscribe, and share. You hear that all the time with everything that you watch, and yet it really is important. It's important to help us. So please do so. And thank you very much. Have a great week. Have a wonderful week. We'll see you again.